She knelt on the cracked sidewalk with a foil-wrapped sandwich shaking in her hands, and her heart pounding so hard she thought the whole street could hear it. Grace Sterling, a woman worth $400 million, was crouched in front of a garbage man in a stained tank top and thrift store shorts, praying he would not recognize her. 6 months of testing strangers had led her to this exact moment. Every single man before him had failed. She was starting to believe the man she needed for her daughter simply did not exist anymore in this world. 2 years earlier, Grace had buried her husband on a rainy Tuesday in October and inherited a logistics empire she never asked to run. She was 34 years old, raising a 6-year-old daughter named Emma completely alone, and every night after Emma fell asleep, Grace sat in her enormous empty kitchen wondering who on earth she could trust with her daughter's heart. Money had turned every man who approached her into an actor. They complimented her eyes while calculating her net worth. They asked about Emma while checking their phones. Grace was exhausted in a way that no vacation could fix, the kind of tired that lives behind your ribs. So she came up with something that sounded insane even to her. She started dressing down, wiping off her makeup, borrowing a beat-up sedan from her assistant and driving into the roughest, most overlooked corners of the city. She carried a foil-wrapped sandwich and offered it to strangers, just to watch what they did next. Did they snatch it and walk away? Did they sneer at a homeless-looking woman? Did they see a person or did they see nothing at all? She had done this 11 times in 6 different neighborhoods, and 11 times her heart had broken a little more. Before we continue, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment telling us what state you're watching from. I believe this story reached you today for a reason. The man in front of her that morning was named Jake Turner, and he had been up since 4:30 hauling trash cans down 5th and Miller in the kind of July heat that makes your shirt stick to your spine by 7 a.m. His gloves were black with grime. His boots were held together with duct tape on the left toe, and there was a streak of sweat cutting a clean line down through the dust on his forehead. He hummed something low and familiar under his breath, an old hymn his mother used to sing, and he did not stop humming even when the smell coming off the dumpster nearly knocked him sideways. Jake Turner did his job like a man who believed somebody was always watching, even when nobody ever was. Grace held out the sandwich with hands that would not stop trembling. Jake looked at her for a long moment, really looked, the way almost nobody looks at a stranger on the street anymore. Instead of grabbing the food, he asked her name first. He asked if she had eaten anything herself that day. When she lied and said she was fine, he tore the sandwich in half without a second of hesitation and handed one piece straight back to her, insisting neither of them was walking away hungry on his watch. Damn, Grace thought, gripping that piece of bread like it was made of gold. Nobody had done that. Not one single person out of 11. He told her, without a hint of self-pity, that he was raising twin 8-year-old boys by himself after their mother left 3 winters ago, that he picked up double shifts whenever the city offered them, and that Sunday mornings were the only hours he had left for church and for breathing. He said it plain, no complaint in his voice at all, like hardship was just weather he'd learned to work around. Grace sat back on her heels on that filthy sidewalk and felt something crack open in her chest that she hadn't expected, something that felt dangerously close to hope. That was when the black company delivery van rolled slowly past the corner, the gold Sterling Logistics emblem catching the morning light on its door, and the driver behind the wheel turned his head and squinted directly at her face, like he knew exactly who he was looking at. Grace did not sleep that night. She lay in her enormous bed in her enormous house and stared at the ceiling, replaying the way that delivery driver had squinted at her, wondering if he had truly recognized his own boss, kneeling on a filthy sidewalk in cut-off shorts. By the time the sun came up, she had convinced herself it was nothing, just a tired man glancing at a stranger, but her stomach stayed knotted anyway. She had too much riding on staying invisible. If word got back to the wrong person, everything she was trying to build for Emma could fall apart before it even started. Here is the part Grace had not told anyone, not her assistant, not her sister, not one living soul. Buried in her late husband's will was a clause his lawyers had drafted years before either of them imagined he would die so young, a clause meant to protect the company from being run by a grieving widow with no experience. It stated plainly that if Grace did not remarry a suitable partner within 18 months of his passing, Controlling interest in Sterling Logistics would transfer to the board, led by a sharp-eyed, silver-tongued executive named Richard Voss. She had 6 weeks left. 6 weeks, or she would lose the very company her husband spent 20 years building. The one thing besides Emma that still connected her to him. Richard had been circling her for a year already, dropping by her office with flowers and forced concern, suggesting again and again that a merger between their families would solve everything so cleanly. He was polished, patient, and about as warm as a boardroom table. Grace had watched him charm every investor in that building, and she had learned, the hard way, that charm and character were almost never the same thing. She refused to hand her daughter a stepfather chosen out of financial panic. That refusal was exactly why she was out on cracked sidewalks handing sandwiches to strangers instead of accepting Richard's dinner invitations like a sensible woman would. 3 days after meeting Jake Turner, Grace found herself parked half a block from 5th and Miller again, telling herself it was simply research, nothing more. She watched him finish his route just past noon, peel off those grimy gloves and walk 2 blocks to a cramped little rec center, where his twin boys were waiting on the front steps with their backpacks already halfway off their shoulders. The second they spotted him, both boys sprinted straight into his arms even though he still smelled like a dumpster, and Jake swung them both around, laughing like he had not been awake since 4:30 that morning. Something about the pure, unguarded joy on his face made Grace's throat tighten in a way she was not prepared for. She got out of the car before she could talk herself out of it, telling herself one more conversation would not hurt anything. Jake recognized her instantly and smiled like she was someone worth remembering, which nearly undid her right there on the sidewalk. He introduced his sons, Tyler and Mason, who immediately asked if she wanted to see the caterpillar they'd found. And for 20 minutes, Grace sat on those concrete steps in the afternoon sun, watching a caterpillar crawl across a boy's dirty sneaker, forgetting entirely that she owned a company worth billions. Jake mentioned, quiet and unbothered, that their mother had left 2 winters ago chasing a life that didn't include diapers and daycare pickups, and that some nights it was just him, a pot of macaroni, and 2 boys who deserved so much better than what the world had handed them so far. He said it without asking for pity, the same way he'd said everything else, like the hard parts of his life were simply facts to be carried, not wounds to be nursed. Driving home that evening, Grace's phone buzzed with a text from her assistant that made her blood run cold. Someone in the office had been asking questions, quietly, about where she disappeared to during her unscheduled afternoons, and the questions had reportedly come straight from Richard Voss's assistant. Grace gripped the steering wheel and forced herself to breathe. She was not ready to lose this, not the company, and God help her, not this strange, unexpected warmth she had stumbled into on a garbage-strewn sidewalk. Whatever Richard was starting to suspect, she had 6 weeks to make sure it did not cost her everything. The email arrived at 6 the next morning before Grace had even finished her coffee, summoning her to an emergency board meeting at 9 sharp. She knew exactly who had called it before she even opened the message. Richard Voss did not waste time once he smelled weakness, and apparently a handful of grainy photographs from a company delivery driver had given him exactly the opening he'd been waiting a year for. Grace stood in her kitchen with her hands wrapped around a cooling mug and felt the familiar cold drop in her stomach, the one that told her this was not going to be a good day. The boardroom felt colder than usual when she walked in, 12 faces turned toward her, and Richard standing at the head of the table like he already owned the chair. He slid a folder across the polished wood without a word, and inside were 3 photographs, grainy but unmistakable, of Grace kneeling on a sidewalk in 5th and Miller in a stained tank top, handing food to a garbage collector. Richard's voice stayed smooth and concerned the entire time he suggested, in front of the whole board, that perhaps the strain of running a company this size alone had become too much for her, that her recent behavior raised serious questions about her judgment, and that the shareholders deserved stability rather than a CEO wandering the roughest blocks of the city unaccompanied. Grace sat perfectly still and let him finish because interrupting him would only prove his point. What came next was the part that truly knocked the air out of her lungs. Richard reminded the room, almost gently, that under the terms of her late husband's will, any remarriage intended to satisfy the succession clause required board approval of the partner's suitability, not simply Grace's personal choice. In other words, even if she found a good man tomorrow, Even if she fell in love with the kindest soul on earth, this room full of men in expensive suits could reject him outright and take the company anyway. 6 weeks had just become a trap with no exit. Grace realized, sitting there under those fluorescent lights, that she was not just fighting for time anymore. She was fighting a rigged game, and Richard held every card. That evening, she picked Emma up from school and found her daughter unusually quiet in the back seat, twisting the hem of her dress the way she always did when something was bothering her small heart. When Grace finally asked what was wrong, Emma admitted, in the smallest voice, that she'd overheard the housekeeper talking about a wedding and got scared that her mommy would marry someone who didn't like kids, someone who wouldn't want to hear about her day or check under the bed for monsters. Grace pulled the car over on a quiet residential street and held her daughter for a long time, promising her something she wasn't entirely sure she could keep. She promised Emma that whoever came into their lives would have to earn it first. Real love. Not a signature on a piece of paper. That promise was exactly why Grace decided, right there in the car, that Jake deserved to hear the truth from her own mouth before he heard it from anyone else. Keeping him in the dark any longer felt cruel now. Dangerous even, given what Richard was capable of. She drove straight to the rec center at dusk, rehearsing the words the entire way, her heart hammering harder with every red light. She was going to tell him everything, her real name, the company, the will, all of it, and pray it did not change the way he'd looked at her on those concrete steps 3 days earlier. She was too late. Richard's black sedan was already parked outside when she pulled up, and through the window she could see him standing on the sidewalk with Jake, that same folder of photographs open between them. Grace's blood turned to ice as she got out of the car and heard the tail end of Richard's honey-smooth voice, explaining exactly who Grace Sterling really was. A billionaire, his boss, a woman who apparently found it entertaining to play dress-up in poor neighborhoods and hand out sandwiches like some kind of charity experiment. Jake turned toward her slowly, and the look on his face was not anger exactly. It was something worse. A kind of quiet collapse, like a man realizing the ground he'd been standing on was never solid to begin with. "Kara," Jake said, his voice low and shaking with a hurt Grace had never heard from him before. "Was any of it even real? Or was I just some kind of test you were running?" Before Grace could get a single word out to explain herself, to explain the will or Emma or Richard or any of the impossible pressure crushing her from every direction, Jake picked his boys up off the steps, one on each hip, and walked away without looking back. Grace stood frozen on that sidewalk between the man who wanted to destroy her and the man who might have actually loved her, and for the first time since her husband died, she genuinely did not know if there was any way left to fix what had just broken. Grace did not go home that night. She sat in her parked car outside the rec center long after Jake's truck had disappeared around the corner, replaying the look on his face until the streetlights blurred through her tears. Somewhere around midnight, sitting alone in that dark car, something inside her hardened into resolve instead of grief. She had spent 2 years letting other people, boardrooms, lawyers, a dead man's claws, decide the shape of her daughter's future. She was done letting Richard Voss write the ending to her story. Whatever it cost her, she was going to fight, not just for the company, but for the one honest thing she'd stumbled into on that sidewalk. She walked into the office at 7 the next morning and went straight to Richard's door without knocking, catching him mid-sip of his coffee with his tie still loose around his neck. She told him, flat and steady, that she knew exactly what he was doing, using her husband's grief-driven will against her, hiring someone to trail her, weaponizing a moment of genuine kindness to make her look unstable in front of people who barely knew her. Richard set his coffee down slowly and smiled, the kind of smile that made Grace's skin crawl, the smile of a man who thought he'd already won. He told her, almost bored, that business was business, and that sentiment had no place in a boardroom, and that she had exactly 4 days left before the vote. What he said next was the moment the ground genuinely shifted under her feet. Richard mentioned, almost carelessly, that her husband's lawyer, an old college friend of his, had been extremely cooperative when the succession clause was drafted 5 years earlier, back when her husband was perfectly healthy, and none of this was supposed to matter for decades. Grace felt her whole body go cold. That clause was not some innocent protective measure written out of love. It had been engineered years in advance by Richard's own hand, sitting quietly in a legal drawer like a loaded gun, waiting for exactly this moment. "No way," she whispered, more to herself than to him. He had been planning this since before her husband ever got sick. She walked out of that office shaking, but she did not go home. She went straight to her husband's old attorney, a soft-spoken man named Walter who had retired from active practice but still kept every file he'd ever touched, out of habit more than anything else. Grace showed up unannounced, laid everything out, and watched Walter's face change as she described what Richard had let slip. Walter disappeared into a back room for nearly 20 minutes and returned with an old email chain he had never fully understood the significance of until that exact moment. Correspondence showing Richard pressuring the firm to insert the board approval language into the clause, months before her husband's diagnosis was even known. The emergency board meeting Richard had scheduled to seal her fate became, instead, the meeting where everything came apart for him. Grace stood at the head of that same polished table, hands steady this time, and read the email chain out loud in front of every single director in the room. For one long, terrible moment, nobody moved, and Grace genuinely believed she'd misjudged the room entirely. That loyalty to Richard's years of polished charm would outweigh a piece of old correspondence. 2 directors actually exchanged a skeptical glance, and Richard, red-faced but recovering fast, tried to spin it as ancient history, a misunderstanding blown wildly out of proportion by a grieving widow. Then Walter stood up from the back of the room, where he'd been sitting quietly the entire meeting, and confirmed under his own name and reputation that the language had indeed been altered at Richard's specific request, a fact he was prepared to state under oath if it ever came to that. The temperature in that room changed instantly. Within 11 minutes, a majority vote stripped Richard of his position entirely, escorting him out of the building he had spent a year scheming to control, and the succession clause itself was voided on grounds of documented interference. Grace had won the company back completely, free and clear, no strings, no deadline, no wedding required to anyone the board approved of. She should have felt triumphant walking out of that building into the afternoon sun, and for about 30 seconds she almost did. Then the weight of what actually mattered came crashing back down on her all at once. The company was saved, but the one person she actually wanted standing beside her thought she'd used him as some kind of charity experiment, and he had walked away with his boys without giving her a single chance to explain. Winning back Sterling Logistics meant nothing if it cost her the only genuine thing she'd found since her husband died. Grace got into her car, hands trembling for an entirely different reason now, and drove straight toward 5th and Miller, praying it was not already too late to fix the one thing money could never buy back. Grace found Jake's address through the rec center director, an older woman named Miss Patty, who took one look at Grace's face and decided, without being asked, that this was a woman who needed a little help. Jake lived in a small rented duplex with a sagging porch and a wind chime made out of old spoons, the kind of house that told you everything about a man's priorities before he ever opened his mouth. Grace sat in her car outside for almost 10 full minutes, rehearsing words that kept falling apart in her throat, before she finally made herself walk up those porch steps and knock. Jake opened the door in a faded t-shirt with Tyler hanging off one leg, and the moment he saw her, his face closed up like a shop at closing time. He told her, quiet but firm, that she should go, that he had nothing to say to a woman who'd apparently been testing him like some kind of science experiment for her own entertainment. Grace stood her ground on that porch even as her eyes filled with tears, and she asked for just 5 minutes. 5 minutes to explain the whole truth, and if he still wanted her gone after that, she promised she would leave and never bother him again. Something in her voice, raw and stripped of every ounce of polish she usually wore like armor, made him step aside. She told him everything, sitting on the edge of his worn couch while Mason quietly colored on the floor nearby. She told him about her husband's death, about the clause designed to trap her, about Richard's year-long campaign to steal a company that wasn't his, about 11 other men who had failed a test she never actually meant as cruelty, only as desperate hope. She told him the sandwiches were never about charity or entertainment. They were about a scared, exhausted mother trying to find one honest human being on earth who would love her daughter for who she was and not for what she was worth. By the time she finished, her voice had gone hoarse, and Jake was staring at the floor with his jaw working like he was fighting something down. He finally looked up and asked her the one question that mattered most: whether any part of what happened between them on those concrete steps had actually been real for her. Grace told him the truth without hesitation, that watching him split that sandwich in half without a second thought had cracked something open in her chest that she hadn't felt since before her husband got sick, and that every single moment since had been the realest thing in her entire overcomplicated life. Jake sat with that for a long moment, rubbing a hand over his tired eyes, and admitted, quiet and rough, that he'd spent the last 2 days furious at her, but furious mostly because he'd let himself hope for the first time in 3 years, and hope terrified him more than anything else ever had. Tyler, who had apparently been listening from the hallway the entire time, wandered in and asked with the blunt honesty only an 8-year-old can manage whether Grace was going to be his friend's new mom, because Emma had told him at the rec center that her mommy needed somebody nice. The whole room went still for a second, and then Jake laughed, really laughed for the first time since she'd walked through his door, and something in that sound told Grace they were going to be okay. 6 months later, on a warm Saturday evening with the sun sinking low and gold over a backyard strung with simple paper lanterns, Grace Sterling married Jake Turner in front of 40 people who actually mattered to both of them. No board members, no company jets, no cameras. Emma walked down a short grass aisle scattering flower petals with Tyler and Mason marching proudly on either side of her in matching little suits Jake had picked out himself, insisting his boys look sharp for the occasion. Grace wore a simple dress instead of anything designer, and Jake stood at the end of that aisle in a suit that fit him properly for the first time in years, his eyes wet before she'd even taken her first step toward him. Later that night, after the guests had gone home and the lanterns had burned low, Grace sat on porch steps that smelled like cut grass and citronella candles, watching Jake carry a sleepy Emma up to bed while the twins argued quietly about whose turn it was for the top bunk, and she understood something she wished she could tell every exhausted, guarded woman still out there testing strangers with sandwiches, hoping against hope. Real love was never about finding someone who could match your bank account. It was about finding someone who would split what little he had right down the middle without even thinking twice. And somehow, against every rigged odd stacked against her, Grace had found exactly that on an ordinary sidewalk on an ordinary Tuesday morning.